On the 56th floor of the Shard in London, in a glass-walled conference room, 9-year-old Chloe Clark, dressed in a torn sweater and faded jeans, accidentally walked in while looking for her father, the man who cleaned the offices. 4 senior executives, wearing suits that each cost more than $10,000, were in the middle of negotiating a $500 million global contract when they saw her and burst into loud laughter. Philip Montgomery, the CEO, humiliated her by sarcastically asking if she could manage to speak English on top of her East London slang. The little girl, lifting her chin, replied in flawless, Oxford-level English. She then continued in Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, German, Spanish, Japanese, and Portuguese, providing a translation of their own corporate presentation, which she had managed to memorize while listening from behind the door. A dead silence instantly fell over the room. Philip turned pale when the young girl added in Hebrew that her father, the janitor they barely bothered to notice each day, had taught her this knowledge, because knowledge is the only wealth that no one can steal from you. He didn't know that this child had an IQ of 180. He also didn't know that her father, the janitor, was a former ambassador whose reputation had been ruined. Most importantly, he hadn't realized that he had just jeopardized the deal of the century, because Chloe had overheard and understood everything they had discussed. For Chloe Clark, the day had started like any other. She had woken up at 5 in the morning in the one-bedroom flat in an East London borough that she shared with her father, John. Breakfast was stale bread soaked in milk, followed by the train journey that took them to London's financial heart. While children her age were still warm in their beds, Chloe would settle into a corner of the janitor's closet in the Shard, devouring old dictionaries she rescued from the office trash bins. Her father, John, started his shift at 6, armed with his brooms and cleaning supplies, going unnoticed by the executives who began to arrive around 8. To them he was nothing more than the cleaning guy, a discreet figure who emptied bins and kept the floors gleaming. No one knew that this man, with his back bent by hardship, spoke 12 languages, held 3 university degrees, and had served his country as an ambassador in 4 nations before a political plot, in which he was made the scapegoat, destroyed his career. On this November Thursday, Chloe had finished her books earlier than usual, a gnawing hunger twisted in her stomach. Lunch wouldn't be until 2 o'clock, when her father would share the ham and butter sandwich he had made at home. She decided to go find him, knowing that at 7 he cleaned the upper floors, where executives decided the fate of companies as casually as they ordered their coffee. The service elevator took her to the 56th floor. The corridor was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the large conference room. She approached silently, a skill she had perfected over years of forced invisibility. Through the crack in the door she saw 4 men in expensive suits sitting around a mahogany table, a piece of furniture worth more than her father's total salary for 5 years. Philip Montgomery, the CEO of Montgomery Industries, was presenting charts and forecasts. Beside him, 3 directors nodded along as they discussed, in a mix of English and French, a deal with Chinese partners that was set to generate $500 million. Chloe listened, captivated, her extraordinary mind absorbing every detail, every figure, every subtle nuance of their discussion. It was when they mentioned the unfavorable clauses they planned to hide from their Chinese partners that Chloe recognized the deception. Her father had taught her that honesty was the only asset the poor could always afford to keep. Without a second thought, she opened the door and walked in. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. 4 powerful figures turned to stare at the little girl in rags who had dared to enter their sacred space. Philip was the first to recover, letting out a cruel laugh, which the others quickly joined. The taunts rained down on Chloe like a hailstorm, comments about her poverty, suspicion that she was probably there to steal, the need to call security. Philip, savoring this moment of casual cruelty, leaned towards her with a smirk and asked if she could manage decent English, or just the slang from her neighborhood. Chloe lifted her chin, a posture she had learned from her father in the face of daily insults. Then she spoke. First, in English so perfect it could have come from Oxford, she translated the presentation they had just given verbatim. Then, without pausing, she switched to Mandarin, repeating the same points with an accent that a Beijing native would envy. The smiles froze on the executives' faces. Continuing her speech, Chloe went on, moving to classical Arabic, then Russian with a Moscow accent, business German, Castilian Spanish, formal Japanese, and Brazilian Portuguese. In each language she repeated not only the presentation, but also the whispered asides they thought she couldn't possibly have heard. The final blow came when she revealed in perfect Hebrew that she knew about their plan to deceive the Chinese partners. She added that her father, the janitor they looked down on every day without a second glance, had taught her that knowledge was the only treasure no one could take from her, and that integrity was the only luxury the humble could afford at all times. Philip Montgomery, a man who dealt with government ministers and titans of industry, was speechless. In 3 decades of his career, no one had ever put him in his place like this, let alone a 9-year-old girl with holes in her shoes. Security was called, but not for Chloe. Philip Montgomery, guided by the instinct that had made him rich, instantly understood that the girl had just revealed information that could ruin the deal and his company's reputation. He invited her to sit down, ordered his executives to be quiet, and began the most surreal interrogation of his life. Chloe told her story with the calmness of someone with nothing left to lose. Her father, John Clark, had been one of Britain's most gifted diplomats, fluent in 12 languages, and the youngest ambassador in the nation's history. Then, 5 years ago, he had been caught in an embezzlement scandal orchestrated by politicians looking to cover their own crimes. He lost everything. His career, his reputation, and his savings were devoured by legal fees. Chloe's mother, his wife, died of a broken heart 6 months later. John had taken a job as a janitor, the only profession no one would challenge him for. However, he never stopped being who he was. Every evening, instead of fairy tales, he gave Chloe language lessons. Instead of cartoons, he had her watch world news broadcasts. The little girl, whose IQ had been tested at 180 during a free screening at her state school, absorbed everything like a sponge. Philip listened, skeptical. He had one of his assistants verify the story. Within 20 minutes, he had confirmation. John Clark had indeed been a rising star in British diplomacy, his fall caused by a scandal where he had served as a shield while the real culprits kept their seats in Parliament. The scene became even more extraordinary when Philip asked Chloe to provide a live translation for an upcoming conference call with Tokyo. The child did so without hesitation, not only translating but improving the conversation, catching cultural nuances that had eluded the certified translator paid £1,000 an hour. It was at that moment that John Clark burst into the room, frantic. He had noticed Chloe was missing and had been searching for her. Finding his daughter sitting at the executive table horrified him. He expected to be fired on the spot, sued, or even have social services called. But to his astonishment, Philip Montgomery stood up and did something unexpected. He walked over to John and offered him his hand, not the condescending handshake the wealthy give to the less fortunate, but a firm, equal grip. He then said the words that changed everything. He needed their help. The deal with China was in jeopardy. Their counterparts had sensed the deception and were threatening to walk away. They needed someone who could speak to them in their own language, not just linguistically, but culturally. Someone with the diplomatic skill to turn the situation around, someone like John. The offer was direct and staggering. John would be hired as the lead consultant for international relations, with a monthly salary greater than what he earned in a year as a janitor. Chloe would be given the best education money could buy, including private tutors and access to programs for gifted children. In return, he had to save the deal and make Montgomery Industries a truly global company. John refused. Pride, the one thing the humble cherish more than the wealthy, forbade him from accepting what he saw as charity. It was Chloe who persuaded him, whispering in Swahili, their 13th language of study, that it wasn't charity, it was justice, and that he deserved a chance to reclaim his life. 3 weeks later, John Clark walked into the Shanghai offices of the China International Commerce Corporation, not as a janitor, but as the special envoy for Montgomery Industries. At his side was Chloe, now properly dressed, but simply, having insisted her outfit cost no more than £100. The contrast with the French executives accompanying them, uncomfortable in their luxury attire, was stark. The Chinese partners were already aware. Word of the attempted scam had reached them, and the atmosphere in the negotiation room was glacial. The head of the delegation, Mr. Chen Wei, a seasoned veteran of global deal-making, was waiting with the expression of a man ready to humiliate yet another arrogant Westerner. John began his speech in flawless Mandarin, not the textbook version so many Westerners learn, but with the subtle dialect of a Beijing native, picked up during his years as an ambassador. But he didn't talk about business. He told the story of a fallen man, of a little girl who learned languages from dictionaries salvaged from trash cans, and of how dignity could survive even in the deepest poverty. Chen Wei listened without moving, but his eyes betrayed a shift. When John finished his story, a long silence filled the room. The Chinese tycoon then did something unexpected. He turned to Chloe and asked her, in Mandarin, for her opinion on the proposed deal. The little girl answered with a wisdom that left the room speechless. She broke down the flaws in the original proposal, suggested adjustments that would benefit both sides, and most importantly, she outlined a partnership model based on mutual transparency. She spoke, switching between Mandarin and Cantonese to address an assistant from Hong Kong, showing an understanding of local dynamics that many adult experts lacked. Chen Wei let out a laugh, the first genuine sign of amusement his team had heard in years. He announced that he would sign the deal with Montgomery Industries on one condition. John and Chloe would have to serve as the personal guarantors of the agreement. A disgraced ex-diplomat and a 9-year-old girl would become the promise behind a $500 million contract. The flight back to London was surreal. Philip Montgomery, used to being in control of every situation, found himself being led by a janitor and his child. However, the real surprise came when John calmly stated his terms. He would accept the position, but Montgomery Industries had to establish a scholarship fund for gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. Chloe would be the first recipient, but not the last. The launch of this initiative revealed a stunning reality. In the outer boroughs of London, among the children of immigrants and families struggling with poverty, were dozens of hidden prodigies. Children who spoke multiple languages learned from refugee parents, who solved complex math problems for fun, and who possessed extraordinary talents, tragically held back by poverty. Chloe became the face of the program, but she consistently refused the spotlight. She continued to live in the same area, though now in a more suitable home. Every afternoon, after her lessons with the best tutors money could buy, she would return to her neighborhood to teach languages for free to the local kids. Philip watched this with growing admiration. This child, who had the power to humiliate him, who had every reason to hate the world that had cast her aside, was choosing instead to build bridges. At a company dinner where Chloe was invited to speak, an arrogant executive remarked that it was surprising a child from her background could be so intelligent. Chloe looked at him with the same unnerving composure she had learned from her father, and replied in perfect Latin before translating. "Greatness is not a matter of birth, but of deeds. And you, sir, by your actions tonight have shown a poverty far greater than any I have ever known." 6 months after the China deal was signed, Montgomery Industries was a case study in business schools. The company that had been on the verge of ruin due to greed was now a benchmark for ethical international trade. John was heading a department of 50 employees, all multilingual and from unconventional backgrounds. Chloe, now 10, was the youngest unofficial consultant in French corporate history. But success created enemies. The former executives, humiliated by a child, plotted their revenge. They hired private investigators to dig into John's past, hoping to find proof that the diplomatic scandal was real. They spread rumors that Chloe was a corporate spy and that her genius was an act. The breaking point came during the annual shareholder meeting. In front of 200 of Europe's most influential investors, Vice President Francis Blackwood presented documents proving John's guilt in the scandal from 5 years earlier. The documents were forgeries but skillfully made. The atmosphere in the room turned toxic. Investors were already whispering about pulling their funds. It was then that Chloe asked to speak. 10 years old, barely 4.5 feet tall, she climbed onto the stage reserved for CEOs and titans of industry. She began her speech not in her now famous 9 languages, but in a 10th, the language of data. She projected a forensic analysis of the forged documents onto the screen, which she had conducted over the past 24 hours. She pointed out chronological inconsistencies, falsified digital signatures, and metadata that revealed the true origin of the files. But she didn't stop there. She revealed that she had recorded all the conspirators' conversations over the past 3 months. It was legal, as the conversations had taken place in common areas of the company where she was allowed to be. The assembly listened in absolute silence as a 10-year-old girl dismantled a corporate conspiracy with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. When she finished, she projected one last item, a letter from the French ambassador who had orchestrated the original scandal, now retired and consumed by guilt, confessing everything and completely exonerating John. Francis Blackwood and his co-conspirators were arrested that evening for defamation and forgery. But Chloe did not celebrate her victory. She requested a private meeting with Philip and made a request that baffled him. She asked that Blackwood and his cronies be pardoned on the condition that they commit to teaching voluntarily in inner-city schools for 1 year. Philip didn't understand. His people had tried to destroy everything, but Chloe, with a wisdom beyond her years, explained that hatred was a luxury the poor couldn't afford, that turning enemies into allies was the ultimate victory, that her father had taught her that mercy was not a sign of weakness, but the highest expression of strength. John, watching the exchange, wept silently. His child had learned the most important lessons, the ones not found in any dictionary. A year later, Chloe was 11 and now fluent in 12 languages. Montgomery Industries had become a global leader in ethical commerce, with branches in 30 countries. The scholarship program had identified and nurtured over 200 child prodigies from underprivileged areas across France. It was in the midst of this success that the letter arrived that would, once again, change everything. A Swiss government official contacted John with astounding news. Chloe's paternal grandmother, whom he had believed to be dead for decades, was in fact still alive and was leaving her a fortune. This woman, Marie Claire Clark of the Rothschild family, had been disowned by her relatives for marrying a lower-ranking diplomat instead of the nobleman chosen for her. Marie Claire had moved to Switzerland, built an empire in ethical diamond trading, and had become one of Europe's wealthiest women under an assumed name. She had watched John's career from afar, felt his downfall, and had kept a discreet watch over Chloe. Now, with terminal cancer, she wanted to meet her granddaughter before she died. The trip to Geneva was emotionally draining. The lakeside mansion was a monument to luxurious isolation, filled with wealth but devoid of love. Marie Claire, carrying the weight of 92 years of restrained aristocracy, lay in a bed that cost more than John had earned in his entire life. The encounter between the old patrician and the gifted child was intense. Marie Claire spoke in Old French, testing Chloe. The granddaughter replied in the same dialect, then continued in Swiss German, before moving on to 17th-century French, which she had learned from reading Molière in its original version. For hours, the grandmother and grandchild conversed in languages spanning centuries and continents. Marie Claire passed away 3 days later, holding Chloe's hand. The inheritance she left was staggering. 800 million euros, but with strict conditions. Chloe would inherit the full amount at the age of 18, only if she met a series of criteria, obtain degrees in at least 3 different fields, volunteer for a year in a developing country, and most importantly, never forget where she came from. Philip Montgomery, who was present at the reading of the will as a witness, was stunned when Chloe, now one of the richest children in theory on the continent, declared her intention to change nothing about her life. She would continue to live in her neighborhood, attend the local state school, and teach the kids nearby. However, there was one project she wanted to start immediately, a global free school for refugee and immigrant children, where languages would no longer be barriers, but bridges. There, Syrian children could teach Arabic to French kids, and young Ukrainians could share Russian with Senegalese fathers, who would teach Wolof in return. This initiative sparked immediate political opposition. The idea of a school where immigrant languages were treated with the same dignity as French shocked traditionalists. But Chloe had learned the art of negotiation from her father. She organized a public demonstration where 100 children from the suburbs recited Les Miserables in 20 different languages, proving the universality of Victor Hugo, and that French culture only grew stronger by embracing the world. 5 years after her memorable entrance into that conference room, Chloe Clark was 16 and fluent in 18 languages. Her school, named the Babel Academy, had branches in 10 French cities and was about to expand across Europe. John had been appointed as the UK's ambassador to the United Nations, his honor fully restored. Philip Montgomery, transformed by the experience, had turned half of his conglomerate into a social enterprise. The 5th anniversary celebration of the Academy was held, symbolically, in the same conference room at the Shard where it all began. Government ministers and diplomats were in attendance, but most importantly, hundreds of children who had found a home and a future in the school. Chloe took the stage, no longer the poorly dressed child from 7 years ago, but still modest in her 100-pound outfit, a promise she had made to herself. She began her speech in French, then flowed between languages like a river crossing borders, carrying with her the stories of children who had turned their diversity into a strength. She spoke of Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who now taught Arabic calligraphy and had won a scholarship to Oxford. Of Oksana, a Ukrainian who had fled the war, discovered her talent for mathematics and was now working with CERN. And finally, of Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants, who had designed a real-time translation app adopted by the UN. But the most powerful moment came when Chloe invited the true heroes of the story onto the stage. Not the wealthy benefactors or enlightened politicians, but the janitors, the cleaners, the dishwashers who work tirelessly every day to give their children a chance. John was the first to go up, followed by dozens of parents in their work uniforms, their hands worn from labor, but their eyes shining with pride. Francis Blackwood, the former executive who had tried to destroy them, was in the audience. After his year of community service in the suburban schools, he had found a purpose he never knew he had. He now volunteered to run mentorship programs for at-risk teenagers. When Chloe publicly thanked him for his contribution, the man wept uncontrollably, redeemed by what had started as a punishment. Chloe's speech climaxed with an announcement that moved everyone in the room. She had decided to renounce her grandmother's inheritance, all 800 million of it, to establish the world's largest educational foundation, but with one condition. Every euro donated had to be matched by 1 hour of volunteer work. Wealth without personal commitment, she said, was meaningless. Philip Montgomery was the first to stand, pledging 100 million euros and 10,000 hours of personal mentorship. He was followed by others in a cascade of generosity that turned the event into something magical. However, the most touching moment was when the Academy's students appeared on stage and in perfect unison recited a poem in 18 different languages, their voices weaving together like a choir. The poem spoke of walls becoming bridges, of strange words becoming familiar songs, and of how true wealth is not measured in pounds, but in the number of people you can understand, cultures you can embrace, and barriers you can tear down with the simple power of a word. The final photograph from that event, taken by a professional and now famous, shows Chloe in the center, surrounded by children of all races and backgrounds, as her father John watches with boundless pride. In the background, through the building's glass walls, London glittered in the darkness, a city that had learned that the future is spoken in all languages, and that a humble child with holes in her shoes could teach the powerful that the only wealth that matters is the one you share, not the one you hoard. A decade later, Chloe would become the youngest Secretary General of the United Nations, fluent in 27 languages and mediating disputes once thought unsolvable, but that is another story. This is the story of a 9-year-old girl who, by accidentally walking into a meeting room, proved that languages are not barriers but keys, and that the greatest power on earth is not money, but the ability to understand and be understood. In her UN office, Chloe keeps a framed photo from that first day, where in her worn sweater she faced down men in 10,000-pound suits. Below it is a plaque with the motto her father taught her every night in a different language. Knowledge is the only wealth no one can steal, and kindness is the only strength that requires no violence. The Babel Academy now operates in 50 countries, has educated 1 million multilingual children, and has proven that in a world built of walls, languages are the ladders to climb them. And it all started with one child who spoke 9 languages and had the courage to use them. However, a thumbs up is always welcome if you believe knowledge is the true wealth. Leave a comment telling us which part of the story moved you the most. Share this with someone who needs to know that talent doesn't care about social background. Subscribe for more stories that show the power of one person to change the world.